Welcome to Unit 4, The Modern World, Lesson 22, Early 20th Century. Artists of the early 20th century, inspired by science, philosophy, and technology, sought to move toward a more personal vision through the abstraction of traditional subject matter. This lesson describes the artistic goals and developments of early 20th century art movements. The objectives for this lesson are to identify how Fauves and other early 20th century artists extended the interests of post-impressionists, define expressionism in early 20th century art through a comparison of Fauvism, the Bridge, and Blue Rider groups, describe the artistic goals and development of Cubism in art, trace the shift toward abstraction in sculpture, discuss the American interest in European modern art in the early 20th century, and describe the importance of motion and modern technology to artists of the early 20th century. The topics for this lesson: the Fauves and Expressionism, Cubism, toward abstract sculpture, the modern spirit in America, and Futurism and the celebration of motion.
The first subjects we'll be covering in this lesson are the Fauves and Expressionism. Artists such as Vincent van Gogh, Edvard Munch, and Paul Gauguin all laid the groundwork for later artists to feel comfortable with expressing their personal opinions and emotions in their art. One artist who really latched on to that idea was Henri Matisse. Henri Matisse was already an established artist. If you look on the right side of the slide, we see a painting from 1897 called La Déserte. La Déserte has the typical loose, expressive brushwork that's associated with the artists of the post-impressionist period. In 1905, Matisse saw an exhibit of Paul Gauguin's work from Tahiti, and it completely transformed the way Matisse would approach painting. The painting on the left-hand side of your screen is titled Harmony in Red, The Red Room, from around 1908-1909. This was made after the experience he had in seeing in Gauguin's works a form of personal expression that wasn't very common for the time. As you can see in Harmony in Red, there is no attention to any form of logic in space, as you would see in examples such as La Déserte on the right, which is also by Matisse. Artists saw these formulas as restrictions to their personal expression, and they really started breaking the walls down as far as what was logical in painting. In the beginning, it relates more to technique and structure, and eventually, with the influence of artists being inspired by the work of Freud, it starts eventually going off to dreams and thoughts as well. When Harmony in Red by Henri Matisse was originally exhibited with other works of a similar approach, it was met with an adverse reaction by the French art critics. One particular critic called the artist wild beasts. That term wild beasts in French is fauve, and the Fauves therefore came from that, and there we get Fauvism. Henri Matisse actually never really cared for the name at all, unlike artists like Claude Monet, who actually embraced the name of Impressionism that was originally an insult. Henri Matisse never really ever warmed up to it. This painting is Joy of Life by Henri Matisse. It was painted between 1905 and 1906. This predates the painting we just looked at, Harmony in Red, and if you look at it closely, even though the colors are quite different, you can really see an influence by the style of the Tahitian influence paintings that Paul Gauguin was making. The influence of Paul Gauguin's Tahitian paintings can be seen in the stylization of the characters and the flatness of the space. This painting is by André Derain. It's titled London Bridge from 1906. Derain was a fellow fauve of Henri Matisse's, and also the two were classmates at one time. Derain had a little bit more space in his paintings, but he was also interested in expressing himself through brushwork and color. He personally really enjoyed using discordant colors, colors that didn't necessarily go well together, but they bounced off of each other and make relationships with each other. Art now is becoming much more about personal explorations and expressions. The next movement in art we will be looking at is Expressionism. Expressionism as a painting movement really took hold in Germany. Even though Expressionism was a broad movement, most of the time it gets narrowed down to the category of German Expressionism. One thing that happens in the 20th century is that artists start to form little groups on their own, coming up with their own titles. This is probably, in a way, a slight defensive mechanism that came out of the time where the critics determined the name of the art movement, namely like with the Impressionism and with Fauvism. Within German Expressionism, a few subgroups popped up. One of them was Die Brücke, which is translated into English as the bridge. This was founded by artist Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. The meaning of the bridge was that artists were trying to find an identity for themselves by bridging the gap between old Germany and the positive future that they saw coming with technology, music, and art. The painting in this slide is by Kirchner. It is titled Street, Berlin, from 1913. As a group, the bridge artists wanted other artists to join in and revolt against the influence of the academies on the style and expression that was always controlled by them for almost a century and a half. Art academies were not only in France, they also existed in Germany and England as well as other locations. Part of this artistic revolt is the flattening of space, such as the Fauves did, and also further abstraction of the figures. An artist that worked within German Expressionism but didn't fall necessarily into any particular group was Paula Modersohn-Becker. This is a self-portrait with an amber necklace from 1906. She was heavily influenced by the works of Gauguin, just as Matisse was, and also of Cézanne when she went to Paris. The influence of Cézanne can be seen in the manner in which the artist adorned herself in her self-portrait with the necklace and the flowers, similar to what you can see in the Tahitian paintings from Gauguin. Also the flattening of space through the use of colors and lack of any type of particular shading with a method behind it. Another group that rose out of the German Expressionists was the Blue Rider group, Der Blaue Reiter in German. This group was actually founded by a Russian painter living in Munich. His name was Wassily Kandinsky. Kandinsky felt, as well as other artists at the time, that there was a moral decline in society, and they felt a personal responsibility in trying to promote more positive values through their art. Kandinsky felt that a painting should be an exact replica of some inner emotion. One thing that sets Kandinsky apart from other artists is he was the one who decided to make that leap away from representational to non-representational imagery. He also was convinced that a painting didn't necessarily have to be about anything at all. It could be about a feeling or an emotion. He tended to focus in his art in a way to make people feel as they did when they listened to a piece of music, that it would either please you or displease you, but music didn't always necessarily have a narrative behind it unless it was opera. Kandinsky titled some of his paintings as some composers would. As you can see in this particular painting, it's titled Composition 4 from 1911. The next art movement from the early 20th century we'll be examining is Cubism. Even though there are many other artists leading up to this point, the one individual who typifies the advent of modern art is Pablo Picasso. There's absolutely nothing traditional about this painting. Picasso basically broke all the academic rules of composition, space, the design of a figure in this painting. This is considered his breakthrough, the transformation from an artist that was very experimental at the time, but really needed some type of breakthrough in a sense to kind of get through that wall of the tradition that he was brought up in. He started off as quite a young artist, a protege, so to say, and already had several years of experience by the time he even got to this painting. Picasso borrowed from many influences. That's why he's really kind of hard to define in one sense. Now we can look back on Cubism, and it is defined by a manifesto, which you can kind of consider like a company's statement of purpose. Some of the influences you can see in this work are that of the German Expressionists with the angular figures, particularly Paul Cézanne with the fracturing of space and not necessarily having everything defined by space in what we were traditionally associating with something close, something in the middle, something distant. And one of the biggest influences in this early part of his art career was African masks. By this point in time, there are many publications, museum exhibitions traveling around with masks, as you see as the Coda reliquary figure and the mask from the Ivory Coast. In this painting, La Demoiselle d'Avignon, Pablo Picasso had painted the portrait, basically, of 5 prostitutes, and this was not originally received very well. As a matter of fact, some art historians consider this misogynistic, meaning that it's hateful towards women. Some, on the other hand, view it as a valid piece of work, and it's, of course, up to you to decide as the viewer how you personally feel about this work. An artist that worked side by side with Pablo Picasso in the development of Cubism was artist Georges Braque. This is one of his paintings from 1908 titled Houses at L'Estaque. When it comes to Cubism and its history, it is considered that Pablo Picasso made the initial artistic breakthrough with Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, but it was Georges Braque who really fought hard and continued on with Cubism long after Picasso went off to bigger and better things, so to say. Braque really helped develop the vocabulary and definitely continued to leave his mark with Cubism. Cubism as an artistic movement got its name from this painting in an insult-like fashion, but this time from another artist and not a critic. It said that Matisse had seen this painting and said it looks like nothing but a bunch of little cubes. And from that, there is probably some accuracy within that, but with the Cubists, they attempted to fuse foreground and background and allow you to be counterintuitive in the sense, in the way we perceive space, that sometimes in a Cubist painting you can see all 4 sides of a cube at once. In this slide, we have a comparison between Braque's Houses at L'Estaque and Paul Cézanne's Gardin, which was from about 20 years earlier, and you can see how the early beginnings of the conceptual nature of painting and fracturing space had started originally with artists like Paul Cézanne and eventually developed fully into Cubism. By 1910, Cubism had become a full-fledged artistic movement. Now, George Braque was still leading the way with paintings like this, titled The Portuguese from 1911. In the previous painting we looked at by Braque, you could definitely make out that there was trees, landscape, and buildings, even though they were still fractured and showing multiple angles at the same time. Here, the foreground and the background basically have collapsed into one, and it forms all sorts of angles and new shapes by combining. There really is no sense of space necessarily in this painting. The Portuguese was made during the analytical phase of Cubism, which was between 1910 and 1911, where they really pushed this seeing everything from all sides angle within their paintings. Although it's very hard to tell, the Portuguese is a portrait of a man sitting at a cafe table strumming a guitar. Pablo Picasso yet again made another giant development within Cubism when he made the sculpture titled Guitar from 1912-1913 range. He took Cubism off the canvas and made it into sculpture. Also, before this point, most sculpture had been either carved or modeled. This is the beginning of the assemblage and construction era of sculpture. This was made out of many different pieces of sheet metal. Another stage of Cubism was synthetic Cubism. Pablo Picasso, of course, was very much a part of that. This is a work by him. It's titled Violin and Fruit from 1913. With synthetic Cubism, you repurpose something that originally had another purpose. Say, for example, newspaper articles, magazine clippings, cards, wallpaper, anything that artists could find to reconstitute it in a Cubist composition. The word collage came from the original French term papier collé, which means pasted paper. This is a photograph of Picasso in his studio at Cannes, France, from around 1965. Picasso lived until 1973. He died when he was 91. He was born back in 1881. We are now moving away from Cubism and toward abstract sculpture. One concept that Cubism helped move forward was the idea of simplifying things to their basic essentials. In this slide we have several examples of sculpture by Constantine Brancusi, starting in 1908 and ending in 1915. In the upper left-hand corner we have typically what was his style around 1908 that's titled Sleep. Starting with Sleeping Muse number 1, Brancusi started simplifying his objects. This was related to him experiencing and being influenced by some ancient Cycladic sculptures, as you see in the lower right-hand corner. And if you look at, in the lower left-hand corner, the newborn, we see an example of full abstraction through simplification of form. In this slide we have another sculpture by Constantine Brancusi titled Bird in Space from 1928. At the time when Brancusi was working, the world was going through rapid changes in evolutions in science, mathematics, biology, the mind, dreams, many ideas that artists never really delved into before. Sometimes when an artist simplifies an object down to its basic essentials, such as here in Bird in Space, it becomes more about an idea or a concept than an actual physical representation of an object. Bird in Space represents modern air flight of Brancusi's time. air flight was taken out of the Wright brothers' age, and new aircraft that were more streamlined, made of metal, bright and shiny, and soaring towards the skies were being made. Now on to the modern spirit in America. We'll be going over 3 artists you should remember from previous lessons. This photograph is titled The Steerage from 1907. It is by Alfred Stieglitz. We've gone over Stieglitz before. He was one of the major proponents of modern art in America. He was responsible for bringing artists like Pablo Picasso to America. This photograph is less about the people and more about the composition and the lines that are formed by the various elements in the photograph, namely the stairs on the right, the ramp with the chain links going up to the center rails, and also some of the other portions on the left-hand side of the photograph. Stieglitz said that this photograph was about the straw hat in the center towards the top and the other elements I just spoke of, and not about a ship or about any of the individuals on it. This next slide is of a painting by Georgia O'Keeffe, one of the artists that we've covered extensively in our material. This is titled Evening Star Number 6 from 1917. O'Keeffe made many paintings of the desert. Some of them were highly detailed and photographic in quality, and some of them were heavily simplified, such as this. This is actually a representation of Venus on a night that she experienced it. The little yellow glowing orb in the upper left is Venus. And finally, for the modern spirit in America, we have the 20th century's most influential architect, Frank Lloyd Wright. This is the Robie House in Chicago, Illinois from 1909. Wright brought modern design to architecture, where certain elements are more about the overall look and concept and composition of the building and not necessarily about living space. Wright also designed the Kaufman residence in Bear Run, Pennsylvania. It was the house that we looked at before that had the waterfall coming out from it. We are now at the last portion of our lesson on the early 20th century in art. The next movement we'll be talking about is Futurism and the celebration of motion. The Futurists were very inspired by the Cubists, and they glorified speed. This painting is by futurist Giacomo Balla. It is titled Abstract Speed, The Car Has Passed from 1913. This painting is about the idea of speed, the sensation when metal zooms by and the wind picks up and the sound. It's all lumped into one. The Futurists also had a manifesto like the Cubists, defining what was behind their ideas. Here's part of a quote from the Futurist Manifesto. The world's splendor has been enriched by a new beauty, the beauty of speed, a roaring motorcar. Umberto Boccioni wanted to fuse his sculpture with the space surrounding it when he made this in 1913. This is called Unique Forms of Continuity in Space. Here we have yet another artist trying to convey a sense of movement and motion through a stationary object. One of the unsung heroes of modern art is Marcel Duchamp. He equally participated in many different movements, but the one thing he did is when he did get involved with a particular concept or idea, he really tried to move on and push it forward, as he did with bringing motion to Cubism in this painting, Nude Descending a Staircase, number 2 from 1912. Early on in this course, we saw a ready-made sculpture by Duchamp titled The Fountain, which was the urinal signed by R. Mutt. We'll also be looking more at Duchamp when we go over the Dada movement. In this painting, Sonia Delany Turk attempted to capture the emotion of dancers on a dance floor at a Paris nightclub. This is titled La Bal Bouillet from 1913. What's interesting about this, for such a heavily abstracted work, you really can, in some sense, make out the figures swaying forward and to the left and to the right, although this is more about their movement, so one figure may be represented by several impressions of color and shape. So this is our last slide on our lesson on the early 20th century. Thank you for listening.